seems to be the season for tariff wars. The Trump administration is declaring them on all and sundry, and all and sundry are in the process of retaliating. But what good do tariff wars actually do to one side or the other? And are they worth it? That's what we want to look at today. Here's a couple of quick clips with Mr. Trump giving his view on the validity of tariffs.
These tariffs are going to make us rich as hell. It's going to bring our country's businesses back. What they have to do is build their car plants, frankly, and other things in the United States, in which case they have no tariff.
But can it be that simple? Basically, there are two arguments put forward by the Trump administration. One is that charging tariffs on foreign imports is bringing money into the US, and therefore the US is richer as a result. And the second is that by imposing tariffs, which are only paid by people outside of the US, this will force foreign companies to open factories to manufacture inside the US. Are either of these things valid arguments? Well, let's look at the second one first. Will it force outside companies to move their manufacturing into the US? The quick answer is no, or at least not very much, and not in the short term. Of course, moving manufacturing into the US would avoid the tariff, but on the other hand, typically labour costs are higher in the US, and so those two things counterbalance each other. And almost always in these situations, there are workarounds to be had. The last time America imposed tariffs on China, firms moved manufacturing to places like Vietnam to avoid the tariffs. And even if they do move jobs into the US, it's typically lower skilled jobs, just the putting together of things that have been designed and often made elsewhere. So really, this is not a good set of arguments, and we will put this to one side. But let's move on to the other and more usual argument, which is that imposing taxes on foreign imports means money comes into the US. Well, to investigate this properly, we must, as usual, have a model that's independent of political arguments that allows us to see what the effects of tariffs actually are. So, to make a simple model, we'll assume that there are just two countries trading with each other, and one of them is about to initiate tariffs on the other. So, what should we take as tariffs? Let's take this simple example. Tariffs are applied to 50% of the initiator country's imports, and the country actually imports stuff worth about 20% of its total GDP. So that means 50% of that 20% is affected by tariffs, that is 10%. So an amount worth 10% of its GDP is hit by tariffs. What's the tariff rate? Let's take it to be 20%. Then there's a 20% tariff, that's a tax, applied to 10% of its GDP. So there's an extra 2% overall, 20% of 10%, in new taxes. An extra 2% of GDP is raised in these new taxes, which we call tariffs. Putting in this set of tariffs means that the tax rate in the country effectively increases by 2% overall. Now, although the overall tax rate might increase by 2%, in fact the tariff's only paid by firms that do the importing. It's not paid by workers, not directly. And again, let's assume that workers get about 75% of the GDP produced, whereas firms get the other 25%. Well, this means that rather than raising everybody's taxes by 2%, we would actually be raising the firm sector, that 25% of the economy, by 8%, and not raising the workers' sector at all. If that's the effect of these tariffs, it's essentially an 8% tax increase for firms and no tax change for workers. There's a second effect, which is that once these tariffs are in place, firms have to pay them. Those firms are then going to try and recoup that cost by passing on these tariffs in the form of elevated prices to consumers. They want to pass on this 8% extra tax, which is being levied on their sector, 25% of the economy, which means that overall the average price rise will be 2%. So we have these two effects. Extra tax being paid by the firm sector and a rise in prices as those additional costs are passed on. However, we don't really expect that initial price change to remain there for the rest of time. What will typically happen is that people will change their purchasing preferences, supply chains will change, and essentially that price rise will eventually die out. And of course, it will definitely die out if those tariffs, as is usually the case, are actually dropped after a fairly short period. So we're going to assume, for the sake of the argument, that this price rise remains in place for 5 years, after which its effects stop. So, with this equivalent impact on the economy from tax rises and price rises, we can look to see what the effect of tariffs actually are. Now, fortunately, we have a model of the economy, which we've introduced in previous videos in this series, so we're simply going to run this with those changes. First of all, to see what we're comparing with, we can run the model with no tariffs, that is, no tax changes and no price changes. And if we do that, we get the following results. You can see that in the period we're looking at, GDP eventually rises to a level of about 40 and the price rises to about 1.7. You can see also that there's some periods of unemployment, and finally we can note that the level of spirits, the level of confidence in the economy remains at a fairly high level, around the 75 mark. Now compare that scenario with what happens when we introduce tariffs. We're going to introduce these at time 30 in this timeline. And you can see very clearly one of the effects that if we look at the spirits, the confidence in the economy, that has a severe dip at time 30. It then recovers somewhat, but it still underperforms the level of confidence that we had previously with no tariffs. Looking at the more factual part of the economy, we can see that the price rises perhaps a little less than it did before, and that GDP is quite severely impacted, rising only to 30 at the end of this period, rather than the 40 we had before. Finally, unemployment is also adversely affected. The dips in employment are more pronounced after these tariffs. So perhaps counterintuitively, introducing tariffs actually has a pretty marked and very bad effect on the country that introduces them. In this case, we've seen that the GDP growth rate has been severely decreased. In fact, it's gone down from an annual growth rate of about 2.3% without tariffs to only 1.4% with tariffs. That's really not something you should want for your economy. In fact, what many economists worry about in terms of tariffs is that it may introduce inflation into the economy of the initiator. And in fact, we do see, if we look carefully at the graphs, that inflation does increase immediately after the introduction of the tariff, but it's a relatively small effect, and after a few periods, certainly after the 5 periods we've looked at, we find that the effect of the tariff on prices has disappeared. So the key thing is that it's growth rather than inflation that's going to be your problem if you decide to introduce tariffs. We also noted that spirits confidence takes a knock, and lower confidence is one of those things that tends to have this knock-on effect on future growth. Less confidence, less investment, less growth. Tariffs are like a boomerang. They come back and hit the economy that introduced them. However, perhaps they have an even worse effect on the people they're being applied to, in which case you may think that it's worth taking some pain yourself in order to inflict more pain on your opponent. Now, what's the effect of the tariff on the other country, the trading partner on whom the tariff is being imposed? Well, remember, we're assuming that that trading partner is exactly the same size as the other country. So that means that it's 10% of the trading partner's GDP, that 10% that it's been exporting, which is affected by these tariffs. How much decrease in demand will there be on that 10% of its GDP? Well, this depends on the elasticity of demand. The elasticity of demand just tells us how much demand will change for a given percentage change in the price. And empirical evidence suggests that elasticity of demand is usually somewhere between 0.5 and 1.5, and on average around 1. So we'll just assume that our elasticity of demand here, for simplicity, is 1. That means that if, for example, the price should rise by 10%, then the demand for that good will fall by 10%. Now, in our case, the tariff is a 20% tax on those 10% of exported goods. So that means that those 10% of goods suffer a 20% demand decrease. And that is equivalent to having a 2% demand decrease over the trading partner's entire economy. So the effect of the tariffs on the trading partner is essentially a 2% decrease in demand. How long will this 2% reduction in demand for the partner economy actually last? Again, just like for the effect of price rises on the initiator economy, we will assume that that effect lasts for 5 years. As we said before, after a 5-year period, firms will have found workarounds to the tariffs, or the tariff may well have been dropped. So what we're going to model is the effect of a 2% drop in demand on the partner economy. What does that do? And again, we will assume that this drop in demand starts at period 30. Well, in this case, we can see that the partner economy, the GDP here, also ends up at around 30. So again, it was originally 40 with no tariffs, and now it's shrunk to only 30 with the tariffs. And the price ends up at about 1.5, which is slightly less than the price without the tariffs. Also here, similarly to the initiator economy, we can see that employment suffers, that the downward spikes in employment are larger than they were without the tariffs. And finally, and also similarly to the initiator case, you can see that confidence has shrunk a bit compared to the no tariff case. In this example, the effects on the initiator economy and on the receiving, the partner economy, are almost symmetrical. In both cases, the annual growth rate decreases from 2.3% to about 1.4%. So is it in fact the case that by putting in place tariffs, you hurt your partners more than you hurt yourself? Does it give you some competitive advantage? No. Everyone suffers more or less equally. Not only that, but we can reasonably expect that the recipient economy, the partner, will in fact retaliate and impose similar tariffs back onto the initiator. And what happens then? All the effects we've just seen double. So we get an even worse outcome. Tariffs may sound good. We're fighting our opponents, our country first, but in fact, they create misery all around. Economic illiteracy is not a good recipe for government.